Recently, Yellen visited China to discuss the issue of overproduction. Many are puzzled as to overproduction leads to a drop in product prices, which is good to US customers, and why Yellen would request China to reduce excess production capacity when Americans could purchase more and cheaper. The topic has also sparked discussions about the technological rivalry between China and the US, with some arguing that China would avoid accusations of overcapacity only if it sticks to producing textiles and garments. Actually, these do not constitute the essence. Actually, China was reported to have an overcapacity in textiles in the past, including socks and clothing. It is likely that numerous individuals are not informed about the historical anti-dumping cases filed against China by the United States and Europe. The news from 2005 to 2006 indicates that the United States and Europe were aware of the overcapacity in the textile industry at that time, contrary to the belief that they were oblivious to it. The United States has also enacted anti-dumping measures aimed at Southeast Asia previously. An analysis of China's projected production capacity for the electric vehicle and photovoltaic industries, in comparison to its domestic demand, suggests that the production capacity far exceeds the country's needs. China is indeed an export-oriented country, and its production capacity surpasses its domestic demand, which is normal. The question arises as to why the United States considers this overcapacity. Examining the annual automobile export data of Germany and Japan may provide insight. In 2023, Japan exported approximately 4.4 million vehicles, Germany 3.1 million, and China around 4.9 million, with China's automobile production capacity exceeding 45 million and domestic passenger car sales at about 25 million units. A discrepancy emerges. Specifically, with an actual production capacity of 30 million units, China's automobile production capacity utilization rate stands at about 66%, while the global data figures currently show less than 60%. This implies that if China were to export its entire production capacity, there would be no need for exports from Germany and Japan. Well, if market competition and free trade are at play, and if Germany and Japan are unable to compete with China, it would seem logical for China to capture the market. But why the United States rejects these Chinese products? Despite the affordability, quality, and technological advancement of Chinese hybrid vehicles and electric cars, the US has set restrictions to bolster its own industry. Let's address the topic directly, as the previous rhetoric is quite misleading. Take free trade. For instance, the common belief is that producing goods and selling them in the market constitutes free trade. However, this overlooks the methods of production and the effects that selling these goods may have on others. Chinese textbooks have noted that the influx of British textiles into China during the Qing dynasty stemmed from Britain's overcapacity. This led to the collapse of China's own textile industry, impacting the populace livelihood. Yet, these textbooks omit the reasons behind Britain's overcapacity, while attributed to capitalism in Chinese political texts. The specific origins remain unexplained. Overcapacity is when production surpasses market demand. Our analysis will link overcapacity with debt and clarify why the United States opposes it. Free trade is fundamentally based on the principle of comparative advantage. As proposed by Ricardo, it's about leveraging mutual strengths in resources or technology to produce goods more efficiently for trade. For example, if my factory is skilled at making clothes but needs hose, while your factory is great at producing hose but needs clothes, we can trade to benefit from each other's expertise. Such exchanges are at the heart of free trade. Therefore, our trade is balanced, as I believe the total value of the surplus clothes produced by my factory is equivalent to the total value of the surplus shoes produced by your factory. When does overcapacity occur? Take this extreme scenario: if the hose produced by your factory are too expensive and my factory has no significant technical advantages. How can I manufacture a hose that costs less than yours? For example, even if the quality is not as high, if the price is only a third of yours, I could produce at least 3 hoses for the same cost. I will increase my workers' daily hours from 8 to 14, without weekends off, while your workers continue with an 8-hour day and weekends free. Consequently, my workers can contribute up to 112 hours weekly, compared to your workers' 40 hours. This makes my workforce more cost-effective. Additionally, I will allocate half of my workers to whole production and the other half to continue garment manufacturing, with no cap on overtime. I would tell my workers that they are diligent, in contrast to yours, which I would say they are lazy. At this time, there are more hose and clothes in the market, and you are not willing to let your workers work overtime. As a result, your clothes are not made well, and the hose are not cheap enough for me. You have to buy the things I produce. At this time, you can buy clothes on credit with me. After all, I don't need your hoe anymore. Then after I get you, I owe you. I deposit it. At this point, there is an excess of both clothes and hose. Here, in fact, in international trade, the money I get from you is a surplus, and the money you get on credit is a deficit. At first glance, it might seem that your family has secured an advantage by issuing me, and I owe you, and acquiring various items, which requires my workers to put in extra hours. Similarly, currency, such as the US dollar, is essentially an IOU from the government and central bank. Yet, in truth, my workers earn less than yours, and I, as the factory owner, accumulate most of the profits. In reality, you may face angry unemployed workers at your factory due to a significant risk of credit loss, which necessitates their dismissal. After all, if sales decline, the accruing interest alone can become overwhelming. Then we return to the real world. Now that China has obtained the US dollars, what has it done with them? Buy US assets or assets from other countries? Of course, the largest number of purchases are US assets. Just look at the value of US debt held by the Central Bank of China. Currently, in the United States, both the residential sector and the government are borrowing substantial amounts of money. Indeed, a democratically elected government cannot afford to let its citizens lose their jobs. Observing the growth of U.S. debt from 2000 to 2008 reveals a significant increase, from 5.7 trillion to 9.4 trillion. Similarly, the U.S. deficit during this period also expanded rapidly. Concurrently, China's surplus was growing at a swift pace. Subsequently, as the supreme mortgage crisis unfolded, the U.S. government initiated a debt transfer model to preserve employment for citizens. It could also be argued that politicians, seeking votes, shifted the debt burden from the residential sector to the governmental sector. Observing the data, it is evident that the government sector's debt has escalated swiftly. During that period, China possessed excessive production capacity. The loss of external markets meant that the domestic market was unable to absorb this surplus. Consequently, China initiated a 4 trillion yuan stimulus plan. Although it continued the investment-driven growth model previously discussed in our video on China's growth model, the policy shifted focus more towards boosting consumption. Former Premier Wen Jiabo stated at the time that it was necessary to reduce China's savings rate and increase consumer spending. An examination of World Bank data from that period would reveal an increase in the share of China's household consumption in its GDP. China has started to gradually absorb its domestic surplus production capacity. Subsequently, as consumption in the United States rebounded, China emerged from this crisis. Subsequently, the supply-side reforms enacted by the Chinese government were observed to rejuvenate the economy. When consumption fails to increase, it becomes necessary to reduce production capacity directly. The supply-side reforms of that period primarily targeted sectors like steel. Did these industries experience any surpluses during that time? Let's take a look at the old news. In 2013, the Chinese government itself considered steel production to be overcapacity. BBC reports that China has overcapacity. The official Xinhua news agency discussed how to end excess steel production capacity. Steel companies suffered from declining profits and losses due to overcapacity. In 2013, the United States launched a trade remedy investigation, also known as anti-dumping, against Chinese steel. In 2014, the United States ruled that Chinese steel was dumped. In 2016, European workers took to the streets to protest against Chinese steel dumping. It is obvious that China has a serious surplus of steel. The authorities themselves admit it. But why can't they solve it? We return to our discussion on why America's debt is attributed to China's overcapacity. The growth model of China has contributed to the unemployment of American workers. This is not due to comparative advantages, but rather due to factors such as excessive overtime, unfavorable labor laws favoring employers, and elevated housing costs, among others, to gain a competitive edge. Historically, this model was also employed in the United States, where it was encapsulated by Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List as the infant industry protection policy. The trade protection policy of the United States at that time can be seen from the changes in tariffs. The tariff before and during World War I was around 20.3%, which was already higher than many countries. As for other preferential tax policies for local enterprises, I will not list them one by one. They are basically the same as those in China. After World War I, the United States intensified its efforts and raised tariffs a lot. Later, after World War I, the economies of European countries were damaged. For example, Germany owed a lot of money and no longer had money to buy things from the United States. Then all countries also increased tariffs and implemented trade protection policies. As a result, the overcapacity in the United States has not been eliminated. Hence the Great Depression in the United States. The United States later began to support free trade. Why? Because the United States realized that overcapacity cannot be eliminated by itself. After the Plaza Accord, everyone wonders why the United States made a special US-Japan semiconductor agreement targeting Japanese semiconductors. Because the development of semiconductors in Japan was initially driven by the savings-driven investment model, which was to provide companies with very low loan interest rates, and then the government injected funds interest-free, etc. This led to dominance of the DRAM of Japan in the global market. At that time, Japan also gave priority to its own government in purchasing domestic products. It is understandable to subsidize one's own key industries, but the subsidies must be technology, not production cost. For example, providing very low-cost loans to specific industries is actually equivalent to asking residents to accept low-yield products. But the people who make money are not the residents who provide the saving. This is a case of saving subsidizing investment. The development of science and technology can bring about improvements in productivity and reductions in cost. But using resident savings to reduce costs is not a comparative advantage. In the comments of the previous videos, some viewers asked about the differences between these growth models. When we have time, we will make a video to explain them. Remember to subscribe to our channel. Why does the United States need to bring manufacturing back to the United States? The reason is employment. China's manufacturing industry now accounts for about 32% of the world's total, while China's GDP accounts for about 18% of the world's total. United States' GDP is about 25% of the world. However, the US manufacturing industry accounts for only about 16% of the world. If world trade is balanced, then theoretically, the proportion of one's manufacturing industry in the world should be the same as one's GDP world ratio, which means that China has 14% more and the United States has 9% less. This shows that the United States needs to issue debt to support its missing 9%, because these 9% are imported and all are deficits. Our previous example of hose and clothes has already shown that the deficit is actually debt. If the United States does not want to increase the number of unemployed people, it can only increase debt to maintain it. As debt of deficit countries becomes increasingly unsustainable, manufacturing returns to deficit countries. Exports from surplus countries fell. The trend has become very obvious. Many US policies toward China, although not necessarily all about overproduction, are aimed at combating overproduction. Obviously, all policies are targeted at industries with overcapacity. Finally, let us summarize that the reason why the United States wants to target China's overcapacity is to alleviate its own debt problem and ultimately its own employment problem. As for China, the current problem is how to increase residents' consumption, rather than continuing to expand production capacity. As for free trade, it is based on comparative advantages, not differences in labor conditions, tariffs, access systems, loan interest rates, etc. Although China has been saying recently that there is no overcapacity, the policies introduced by the Ministry and Information Technology, that is, opinions on the lithium battery industry standard conditions and announcement management measures. The content inside has similar characteristics to the supply-side reform of steel at 2016, such as focusing on environmental protection, cultivated land, etc., to curb overcapacity. From an investment perspective, if China does not change its growth model, then we can invest in related companies when China initiates investment, exit when China's investment reaches its peak, because there will definitely be overcapacity in the future. As for the US manufacturing industry, you can consider whether there are targets worth looking at based on US policies.